David took off.
I was working in the global operations, and many of the projects had been going for at least a year or two, and so we set up economic development tracks because the economic wasn't expanding half as fast as it should. So people who had an economic background, I had worked for Arthur Andersen and did consulting in a lot of different companies, so it was helpful for me. And Hale Prather and I went to Asia, and we went to 5 different projects to do economic development. 2 weeks at each project, with I think a week in between each one, or sometimes a week in between each one. And we started out in Kalapadua, which had already set up a water and washing stations within the community that included a place where you could wash clothes and take a mandi, which was a kind of shower, and also the rice program had been very successful. They had, before that, they had picked the man that they were trying to encourage hybrid rice that would produce more, and so they picked the man who's had a rice plot that was known never to produce any rice at all, or never to produce as much as anybody else in the village. And so they set him up with hybrid rice and had a rice expert come in, and he changed the water inlet from the water outlet on the rice paddy, and then put this hybrid rice in, and the yield was 2.5 times more than anybody else in the village. And so the next year, they were lined up out the door to get hybrid rice, and my other favorite story from Klapadua while I was there was they had a community tractor, one of these tractor with 2 handles that you push. It was a big garden tractor, a big one, that they used to plant the rice and to furrow the fields. Mm-hmm. And one day, while I was sitting there, a man came in to Scott Morris, and he said, "Well, so and so lost the pin that holds the plow to the back of the tractor, and we can't use the tractor. And so you've got to get us a new pin." And Scott says, "If you're standing out by the road at 5 o'clock tomorrow morning, you can ride with us to Jakarta, and tonight you figure out from the other farmers where the money's going to come from to buy the new pin. And then we'll take you into town and drop you off at the equipment dealer, and you buy the pin, and then we'll bring you back at 5 o'clock. In other words, what he was saying is, we're not going to get the pin, you're going to get the pin. And it was a sign for me that they were very much saying that this is your project, it's not our project. We're not responsible, you're responsible. And it was a real good lesson, a little lesson of the way we were trying to do things. Because the projects would not be successful if they didn't become their project. Kalapadua was a merging of 3 villages. We decided we were going to do rabbits at Kalapadua, and we sent Scott Morris off to buy some rabbits. And he came back with, not only did he come back with 2 male rabbits, but one of them had a broken leg. And so they ended up doing chickens instead. So sometimes things didn't always work out the way but the chicken project was an extremely big success after we left. And that was one of the things that came out of the economic development, was what didn't look like a success became a success. When Sungai Louie was the first project that we went to, I left Chicago in November, and of course it was snowing in Chicago. And by the time you went through Hawaii and Singapore to Kuala Lumpur, it was 22 hours. And so, and we arrived out at the project about 10 o'clock at night, completely dark, and they sent us to a building that was above a barn. It was the top floor of a barn where they had a couple of cots. And so we went there went to sleep, and of course the sleep was all messed up. And about 2 or 3 in the morning, the dogs got in with the goats that were underneath the floor, and he made this ruckus, and it was totally out of it, what's going on here, and where am I? And then at 5 o'clock in the morning, this man on this top of this minaret, this loudspeaker starts to go off with the morning prayers, Akbar, God is great, and and the whole wailing thing, and and then you wake up again, and you just realize after 24 hours, all of a sudden you're in a completely different world, and other time I was there at Sungai Louie, it was that time we went to breakfast, and all of a sudden we see 6 men carrying a platform down the road with a shroud over it, and an old elderly woman had died during the night. And of course what they do, they don't have any embalming or anything, and the first thing they do in the morning is bury the person, because they have no other way to keep it. And then they have a 3 or 5 day wake, and the whole village participates in that wake. So nothing happens. I mean, the economic development trek just did not start. I didn't go over with those women to talk about the sewing until 3 or 4 days later, because the village closed down. That was one thing that was impressive about these rural villages. The village was all one community. I mean, everybody belonged to the same religion. The religion was the focus in the village. Also, the second Saturday we were there was a wedding, and we were invited to the reception. We weren't invited to the wedding, but we were invited to the reception. And of course, the whole village was at the reception. In fact, in those villages, I think there was one man in that farmer, not at that women, but that one farmer had taken his whole rice crop to pay for the wedding, because when you have a wedding in their culture, you invite everybody in the whole village to come to the wedding. and you pay for the whole thing, and the next year he didn't have a good crop, and so it almost bankrupted him to have that wedding, but it was the thing to do, and that's what they did. It just gave you an insight into the culture, and that was true in several places that we were that people didn't. And let me just talk about Sungai Louis for a minute, because I think even that was the first one. We went to Sungai Louis, and there were several things we worked on there. Did the financial planning for a bean field, and we also, Hale had brought along a dozen wool gloves that had, the fingers hadn't been sewed on yet, and he'd picked them up from some guy along the way before, or sent for them from somebody in Hong Kong that wanted to farm out these gloves to be sew the fingers on. And so I went over to the community center with I don't remember his name, first name, Jayasekara.
Titus
Jayasekara, who spoke the language, and to explain to these group of a half a dozen women what we were going to do with these. And Titus put the gloves out on the table, and they just quickly grabbed them and started sewing the fingers on, and I said to Titus, "Aren't we going to tell them what to do?" And he says, "They know what to do." And within 15 minutes, all the fingers had been sewn on all the gloves. And over in the corner was 2 old treadle sewing machines. After we left, the community built a building, started a sewing industry, and was sewing uniforms for janitors in Kuala Lumpur, and they were sewing up army uniforms, and had a very successful sewing industry. And I like to think it came out of that day when these women understood that they could do this.
Make money.
They could make money on doing sewing. The other thing that happened at Sungai Louis that I was impressed with was that when I was there, I think I was there another time, but one morning we were having breakfast, and this is when Dick West was there. A man came in the back door with a spraying backpack on his back, but I didn't know what it was, and he and Dick West went out on the back, on the side underneath the building to do something, and I said, what are you doing? And he said, after he came back, I said, what are you doing? He says, oh, I just sold him some herbicide, weed killer. And I said, well, what's that all about? And he said, oh, when the communists came down from the north years ago during the Vietnam War, they pulled all the people out of this village and put them into the district village for a year. And so the communists couldn't find anybody to rile up and do anything with in the local village, because there wasn't anybody there. And they couldn't take their food because there wasn't any food. So they went back north again. And then the people went from the district village back into the village again. And what it amounts to is the people in Malaysia did it right, and in Vietnam we did it wrong. But anyway, neither here nor that. But what that left the village with was a rice paddies that were filled with weeds, or a kind of steel grass that you couldn't even cut with a machete. And so Dick West had investigated with the local farm bureau structure, whatever it is, and obtained this quick kill herbicide that would kill this weed once and for all with one spraying, and and then they could grow rice in their rice paddy again, and within a year the village was self-sufficient in rice. That was kind of the underlying contradiction that we had found in the economic when we came there. But that happened before we went on the economic development track. Then we went to Hi-O, and that was, we had helped them start the shrimp ponds. But that was the main economic venture in the village. And I also went to help a woman with a translator. She was setting up a store in a room on the side of her house, a small store, and just helped her figure out what her talk through with her. She knew, but talk through her what her assortment should be, and talk through how she could manage inventory, and how she should keep track of money and income and expense, and caution her on not eating out of the store and that sort of thing. And that store succeeded afterwards. But it was just counseling more than anything else, confidence building.
Mm-hmm.
And we encouraged them to, on this shrimp farm thing, and did some projections. And we were there for Christmas, and of course, in a Buddhist village, Christmas didn't mean anything. And so it was kind of a unique experience, and of course, the weather wasn't much like Christmas.
What happened? What'd y'all do? And what made it unique?
We just had a celebration in our own staff, a Christmas celebration, and the Druckenmillers were there, and we had a celebration with them. Then we went on to Hong Kong, and Hong Kong was one of the most significant ones of all, because they had the only land that had beachfront property in the whole New Territories. It was the only undeveloped beach and in the area. But the British at that time would not let it become developed, because they knew the developers would just rip off the village. And so we had Bill Bonnell was there, and he had set it up a local community set of businessmen and an attorney and a banker to form a not-for-profit corporation, such that it is in Hong Kong, for this village, with the stipulation that they would sell all of this rural land to this corporation, and then they could, in cooperation with these businessmen and an attorney, they could control how the development was done, and that they would provide jobs for the people in the village, and it would they would fund development, the whole thing, through this corporation. And so the British government had gone along with it, but the only thing left to do was to actually decide to do it. And the villagers, I mean, part of this was they had to move some graves. I mean, it was a real serious thing for these people to do this. And there were only two real major families in the village. And anyway, they were just stalling and stalling, and like the Chinese are want to do, they take a long time to make a decision. And Bill said, now this accountant and this attorney and another attorney from Minnesota was with us on the trek, and he said, this accountant and this attorney from the United States are coming to Hong Kong, and it's do or die now. If it doesn't happen while they're here, it won't happen. And of course I was the accountant and this other guy was the attorney, and it didn't make any difference that we were there at all. But Bill had set up this meeting where the two families had to vote on deciding it, and they had to appoint a steering committee. And so it was very clear to us at 10 o'clock that morning that the meeting had already taken place in somebody's house at breakfast. And so it was just a formality that they decided, yes, we're going to do this. And then the local attorney said, now you've got to appoint a steering committee, and they didn't know about this. And so the steering committee had to be 3 people. And the first 2 were easy because it was the son of the elder in the one family and the son of the elder in the other family. But that made the third one very hard. And so they finally decided on a man who was, less than dynamic. But he was from one family and his wife was from the other family. And so they decided that he was the third one because he represented both families by virtue of his family. And that decision got made. That took a little bit longer than the decision to do the whole project. And later they sold the land, and if you went back a year later, every house in the village was refurbished, and because all the families had made money off of selling this land, and that village had really been in the process of raising pigs, and the smell was terrible in the village, but they'd cleaned that up after a year or two. Then we went on to Japan, to Oyubari. By that time it was early in January. We arrived in January with about 6 feet of snow on the ground up in Hokkaido. And it's a little bit difficult to do economic development in a village with 6 feet of snow, and it was an old coal mining community. One thing I remember about that is that we went into it took us into Oyubari to meet the Japanese economic development person for the Hokkaido island. And the first thing he said that was translated from Japanese was, "I don't know why you're here. I don't even know why you're in that village, because we take care of our own economic development in our own good time." And so that was a little bit discouraging. And we were trying to push some woodworking projects and stuff. It really didn't do much. But one of the things that came out of the consult in Oyubari was that they should set up a ski resort. And eventually that's what did happen. And in fact, it was even a ski resort that was somewhat associated with the Winter Olympics that later took place in Hokkaido. So, not that we had too much to do with that, but we had a good time, although it was pretty cold. Under those big down comforters and with these little coal stoves that we had. We were visiting with the Bergdahls and the Shaws were there when we were there. Also went back to Majuro a couple of times. And 1984 went back to Majuro when we essentially closed down the project, and discovered in the process that the money that Joseph Matthews and Neil Vance and Moriarty, what's his first name? Patrick Moriarty had raised in Washington. They had been trying to raise $1 million, $1.2 million for development in the Marshall Islands, economic development, and finally, 8 years later, 600,000 of it came in, and Oscar DeBrun told us that they hired his son and 8 or 10 other young men with that money to go out to the islands to dig up all the old World War II shells and bombs, so that they could replant the coconut trees to use the copra processing plant that had been built at the time we had the consult. And every weapon that they dug up, they drilled into and had dry powder in it. And so that's why they were afraid to dig and plant new trees. And so then the copra processing plant took off. The same time we were there, we discovered that the Japanese were now negotiating their fishing rights, whereas before they never had. And the Japanese were building a new power plant and a new communication system in the Marshall Islands. And Oscar DeBrun told me on that last day in his office, he had a little blue book on his desk that said, and I said, "What is that?" And he said, "That's our next 5-year plan." And he opened a drawer on his desk and he says, it replaces this. And it was the Gold Consult booklet. And he said, we used to be the bottom of the barrel as far as Southeast Asia islands, nations, and now we're so far ahead of anybody else that it's hard to believe. And it wouldn't have happened if the ICA had not come here in 1972. So this was 12 years later. So that was a very significant thing for me to have happen to me.
What was the significance? I mean,
Well, it was just to see that all the struggle we had in that project and all the difficulty we had through the years in that project with economics and things that didn't work, and there were so many things that one time I was there when the power went out, because they didn't have that power unit, and the refrigeration, we had a big truck with a refrigeration unit on it, and of course it depended on power to run this refrigeration unit, and the power went out for about 24 or 48 hours, and of course everything in it, we had to shovel the whole truck out with a truckload of chicken, frozen chicken, and haul it off and feed it to the pigs. Well, you don't make that back in a day or a week or a month. I mean, it's just so much loss. And those kinds of things happened periodically. Just when you're out in the middle of nowhere, 3,000 miles from Hawaii and 3,000 miles from Guam, you can't react to things very quickly. That trek was a transition point in my life in terms of vocation, because instead of working for a company and it had to do with doing, it had much more significance than what I had been doing. Later I did economic development in some of the USA projects in Union Wakagapi, and